The patrol car was a stale metal box, smelling perpetually of lukewarm coffee and dried-out fear. Tonight, it held Detectives Elias Vance and Sarah Mendez, two mismatched pieces of the midnight shift at Precinct 8. Vance, a man whose face seemed carved from granite and regret, drove. Sarah, younger and sharper, was staring out at the rain-slicked sprawl of Viridian City, a concrete beast that only truly woke up after dark. 373, show us en route to Sector 14. Residential B&E in progress, silent alarm, Vance's voice crackled over the radio, flat and weary. B&E at 3 a.m. in the nice part of town. Thrilling, Sarah muttered, adjusting the collar of her jacket. Every case is a case, Mendez. Keeps the lights on. Sector 14 was a pocket of old money Victorians, their ornate facades usually shrouded in quiet dignity. The address, 412 Willow Creek Lane, belonged to the notoriously reclusive architect, Alistair Thorne. No neighbors, high fences, and woods pressing in from the back. As they pulled up, a knot of unease tightened in Vance's gut. The house was dark. Not just unlit, but absorbing the streetlights, a deeper blackness than the night allowed. Silent alarm, right? Sarah asked, her hand hovering near the door handle. Yeah. But look at that. No sign of forced entry. No broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Nothing. The alarm panel next to the heavy oak front door was lit. A small, furious red light pulsed, signifying intrusion. Vance keyed the door code they were given, a standard procedure for high-profile residents. The bolt clicked. The door swung inward on its own, slow and silent, revealing a hallway that stretched into absolute darkness. Hook. The air that rushed out was not the cold night air, but a dead, unnatural warmth, thick with the smell of ozone and something impossibly organic, like a butcher's shop left open to the elements for a week. Sarah was the first to react, pulling her service weapon. That's not right, Elias. That smell. Vance nodded, his hand on his sidearm, the familiar weight a small comfort against the immediate, sickening wrongness. Stay tight. Lights on the house first, then our flashlights. Call back to dispatch. Advise all units we have entry and a potential hazmat situation. Use code 0 Echo. 0 Echo was a code they never used. It designated an anomaly, something that defied all known criminal or natural explanation. A thing the department had been told, in no uncertain terms, did not exist. They moved into the house. The interior was a pristine museum of expensive, eccentric tastes. But the air was heavy, the silence absolute. It swallowed the sound of their boots and the faint drip-drip of the rain outside. The power was out, but not from a tripped breaker. The walls hummed with a residual energy, like a massive appliance had just been violently unplugged. They reached the living room. It was a cavernous space with a high, vaulted ceiling, and there, in the center of the plush, Persian rug, was the first anomaly. It wasn't blood. It wasn't vandalism. It was a hole, not a hole in the floor. It was a hole in the space itself. A perfectly circular void, about 5 feet in diameter, that seemed to absorb the light from their powerful flashlights. The edge looked less like a tear and more like a scar that had been pressed into the fabric of reality, leaving a faint, shimmering heat haze above the perimeter. Sarah gagged, covering her mouth. What in God's name is that? Vance took a cautious step closer, his breath held tight in his chest. Don't touch it. Don't get near it. He shone his light inside. The darkness wasn't just lack of light. It was a profound, suffocating void. And then, faintly, from the impossible depths of the circular blackness, he heard it, a sound like heavy, wet breathing. A sound that belonged to something impossibly large. Vance gripped his gun, his knuckles white. Alistair Thorne isn't here, Sarah. Whatever set off that alarm, it's a trespasser, but not the kind we trained for. The drip drip they heard wasn't rain. It was coming from inside the room. They looked up. A dark, viscous fluid was slowly oozing from the corner of the ceiling, pooling on an antique end table. As the droplet hit the polished wood, the invisible something in the void seemed to sigh, a sound of immense, weary satisfaction. Then, a sliver of white, too straight and too smooth to be bone, slid into the light at the hole's edge, twitching like a curious, pale worm. It was a fingertip. A fingertip that was far too large. The fingertip, long, unnaturally white, and thicker than Vance's wrist, retreated instantly, vanishing back into the absolute blackness of the void. Back up, Sarah. Now, Vance commanded, his voice a low, rough whisper. They shuffled backward, eyes locked on the hole. The organic, ozone smell intensified, becoming acrid, like burnt chemicals and stale blood. Elias, look at the door, Sarah breathed, pointing with a shaking hand toward the hallway they had just entered from. The heavy oak front door, which they had left slightly ajar, was slowly swinging shut. It wasn't being pushed by a draft. It moved with a smooth, purposeful quietness. It's sealing us in, Vance grunted. He reached the hallway just as the massive door clicked shut, the sound echoing unnervingly loudly in the sudden, total silence. He tried the handle. Locked. Deadbolt thrown. That thing didn't do that, Sarah argued, her eyes darting between the door and the hole. It's inside the hole. It can't reach the door. Vance shook the handle harder, uselessly. Something else is in this house, Mendez. Something that controls the systems. He turned back to the living room. Dispatch is likely sending backup, but this sector is remote. We're on our own for the next 20 minutes. He drew his service weapon fully, his flashlight beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. The black hole still pulsed on the carpet, radiating a strange heat. We need to find a secondary exit and sweep the upper floor for the homeowner, Vance decided, injecting a tone of professional routine into the chaos. If Thorne is here, he's either a victim or something worse. They moved slowly, flashlights panning over the decadent furniture and priceless art. Everything was in order, except for the massive, impossible tear in the living room floor. As they passed a large, antique grandfather clock, it began to chime. But instead of the familiar bong, it emitted a dull, choked thud followed by a series of frantic, wet ticking sounds that didn't match the second hand. The hands themselves spun violently backward, stopping precisely at 12:00:00 midnight. 0 hour, Sarah whispered, clutching her weapon tighter. Suddenly, a loud, scraping sound erupted from the floor above, the sound of something heavy being dragged across hardwood. Thorne, or the BNE artist, Vance said, relief warring with tension in his voice. Upstairs. Watch the hole. They climbed the ornate, curving staircase. The air grew colder here, replacing the downstairs heat with a bone-deep chill. The scraping stopped the moment their boots touched the landing. The second floor was a maze of bedrooms and studies. They approached the master bedroom, the door slightly ajar. Vance kicked the door open, entering in a low crouch, weapon raised. The room was vast and dominated by a four-poster bed. On the silk comforter, something was moving. It was Alistair Thorne. The architect. That he wasn't dead. He was kneeling, face down on the bed, naked from the waist up. His back was horribly contorted, the skin stretched and shiny, like tight plastic. Sarah aimed her light. Thorne. Police. Are you injured? Thorne didn't move. But his body began to make a subtle, sickening noise, a sound like rice paper being carefully torn. Then, they saw it. A second anomaly. Thorne's shoulder blades were not where they should be. They were stretched taut and angled impossibly high, pushing against the skin. And from the center of his upper back, a perfect, straight line had been cut, not by a blade, but by some immense, internal pressure. From this incision, something was slowly being forced out. It was a structure of slick, black chitin and white, needle-like protrusions, a segmented limb, not human, being borne violently from the man's spine. Thorne let out a gasp, but it wasn't a sound of pain. It was a sound of immense, choking effort. He was actively pushing the thing out of his own body. "He's not a victim, Elias," Sarah stammered, raising her weapon to fire. "He's a vessel. Hold your fire," Vance roared, instinctively lowering Sarah's arm. "We don't know what that thing is, or what it will do if we shoot Thorne." As if in response, the structure on Thorne's back gave a final, wet heave. A grotesque, multifaceted black eye, the size of a baseball, rolled out, mounted atop the emerging limb. It fixed instantly on the two detectives. The light in the room dimmed abruptly, and the creature's eye seemed to drink the remaining light. And through Thorne's tortured lungs, it spoke, a voice that was multiple sounds at once, a hiss, a whisper, and the deep, wet resonance of the void downstairs. "You were not invited." The monstrosity on Thorne's back began to move rapidly, detaching itself entirely with a sound like tearing leather. It skittered across the bed, dragging Alistair Thorne, now limp and likely dead, off the mattress and onto the floor. It was impossibly fast. Vance didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the creature's chitinous shell with a dull clack. The creature didn't flinch. It merely turned its massive eye toward Vance, and a second, smaller, needle-like limb shot out, slamming into a lamp next to the bed and shattering it. "Run. Get to the stairwell," Vance yelled, unloading 2 more rounds. They scrambled back into the hallway, leaving the echoing, multi-layered voice behind them. Vance pulled the nearest door shut, a heavy library door, and fired 3 rounds into the door frame, locking the heavy deadbolt mechanism. The library door rattled violently as the creature slammed into it from the inside, the wood beginning to splinter. Vance grabbed Sarah's arm. "We're not looking for the BNE artist, Mendez. We're looking for the way out of a container." Vance and Sarah stumbled down the grand staircase, the sounds of splintering wood and rhythmic, wet thudding from the library door spurring them on. The creature was strong, but its movements were hampered by its size and grotesque, newly birthed form. "The kitchen, Sarah. Maybe a service door or a window we can breach," Vance gasped, his lungs burning. They reached the kitchen, a vast, clinical space of stainless steel and black marble. Sarah immediately went for the massive, double-paned window over the sink, sealed shut, and too thick. "We'd need an axe to break through both layers." Vance was already examining the service door, reinforced steel with 3 heavy-duty locks. This house was built to keep things in, not out. Thorne didn't want anyone finding what he was doing. "Or finding him," Sarah added, glancing back at the silent, oppressive hallway leading to the living room. The dark, organic smell seemed to be seeping from the vents now. Vance's flashlight beam swept past a small, unassuming door built into the black marble pantry wall. It was almost invisible, without a knob, marked only by a faint, silver seam. "Bingo," Vance muttered. He noticed a tiny, biometric scanner built into the marble next to the seam. "He's dead, Elias. Or he's what that thing just was. We don't have his print." Vance looked around frantically. His eyes landed on a large, heavy butcher block in the center island. A set of high-end knives was magnet-mounted above it. "We don't need the whole print." Vance ran back to the staircase, his adrenaline masking the caution that should have prevented him from returning to the creature's location. He returned moments later, holding a piece of Alistair Thorne's flesh, a section of the man's severed forearm, still slick and slightly warm. The creature had been messy. Sarah recoiled, but Vance ignored her reaction. He pressed the cold, dead finger to the biometric scanner. A soft, electronic chime, the first normal sound they'd heard since entering, echoed in the room. The silver seam on the pantry door glowed blue, and the door slid silently inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into pitch blackness, a basement. "Where all the secrets hide," Vance said, holstering his weapon and switching to a downward flashlight grip. Thorne was an architect. Architects love basements. "We're going in. Elias, backup is coming. We should wait for Hazmat and SWAT. And let that thing downstairs finish whatever it started? Or let the anomaly on the second floor grow into a new one?" "No." Thorne set off a silent alarm for a reason. He was calling for help, or calling for us to witness. "Let's finish the call." They descended into a tight, concrete bunker, the air immediately turning dry and cold. The basement wasn't a wine cellar or a storage room, it was a laboratory. Fluorescent lights flickered on as they reached the bottom of the stairs, revealing banks of high-end servers, complex electronic equipment, and large, glass-fronted refrigerators humming with life. White boards covered in arcane equations and geometrical symbols lined the walls. In the center of the room was a workbench cluttered with tools. Above it, pinned neatly, was a blueprint. The blueprint was of 412 Willow Creek Lane, Alistair Thorne's house. But it was labeled not as a residence, but as the Conduit, Phase 3 enclosure. Sarah snatched up the architectural drawings. "It's not a house, Elias. It's a cage. Or a transmitter." The plan showed the house's structure, reinforced foundation, soundproofing, and, most chillingly, detailed schematics of the floor-level living room where the void currently resided. A series of metallic conduits were shown leading from the basement servers directly to the perimeter of the hole. The hole downstairs isn't an accident. Thorne made it, Vance realized, his gaze sweeping over the complex machinery. A sudden, jarring noise ripped through the silence of the basement, a rhythmic, deep thump. Thump. Thump, coming from somewhere behind a sealed, reinforced concrete wall at the back of the lab. The thumping vibrated through the floor beneath their boots. "That's not the thing upstairs, Elias. That's something heavier. Something caged," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with mounting terror. Vance found a computer monitor still running. A looping video played on the screen. Thorne, haggard and wide-eyed, standing in the living room, manually activating the floor mechanism. As the circular hole opened, Thorne turned directly to the camera, his face a mask of terror and triumph. In the video, Thorne held up a small, handwritten sign. The message, scrawled in black marker, was a final, desperate instruction: "Do not exit. Seal it. Destroy the source. Pray for Viridian." The thumping behind the concrete wall intensified, now accompanied by a wet, scraping sound, and a fresh wave of that sickening, organic smell, stronger now, concentrated. Vance pointed the flashlight at the glass-fronted refrigerators. They weren't holding chemicals or samples. They were holding identical, perfectly preserved human bodies, 6 of them, naked and pale, with shaved heads. Each one was labeled with a date and a cryptic designation: Replica Alpha, Replica Beta, and so on. The final one, a woman with a strange, stylized tattoo on her neck, was labeled Replica Zeta, Reserve. The thumping stopped. Absolute silence returned. Then, a faint, metallic hiss came from the ceiling vents, followed by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps walking directly above them. Not scraping, not slithering. Walking. A voice, Thorne's voice, but deeper, echoing, and wet, spoke clearly through the vents, directly into the basement. "You found the factory, detectives. But the product is already finished. And it's hungry." The voice echoing through the vents, Thorne's voice, corrupted and amplified, sent a fresh jolt of primal fear through the two detectives. It wasn't the sound of the panicked creature from upstairs. This was calculated, malicious intelligence. That's the thing that came out of Thorne, but it sounds better, Sarah whispered, keeping her weapon trained on the vent. Though she knew it was pointless, Vance ignored the voice, his focus locked on the replicas in the glass refrigerators. He wasn't building a house, he was building a supply. These aren't victims, they're stock. He turned back to the blueprints. There had to be a way to override the system, a master switch for the conduit. A new sound started, a high-pitched, insistent whine emanating from the server banks. Red lights began to flash wildly across the panels. The system is initializing something, Sarah said, glancing at a monitor displaying complex energy readouts. Energy flux stabilizing. Output levels increasing. Whatever Thorne was using the whole for, it's about to start again, at max capacity. The deep, heavy thumping returned from behind the concrete wall, but this time it was faster, more urgent, and closer. The impact was so severe that fine dust sifted down from the ceiling. Vance pointed his flashlight at a keypad next to the concrete wall. The source of the thumping is behind that wall. It's the source Thorne wanted us to destroy. Find the circuit breaker, Sarah. If we cut power to the main grid, maybe we can stop the conduit and that thing upstairs. Sarah found a massive, industrial breaker panel next to the stairs. She flipped the main switches, throwing the basement into immediate darkness, illuminated only by their flashlights. The immediate effect was not what they'd hoped. The server whining stopped, but the lights on the conduit blueprints didn't die. Instead, they switched to a dull, chemical green, and the small, silver conduits running into the floor near the stairs began to hiss and smoke. Backup power, Elias. The damn hole is on a protected circuit. Worse, the thumping behind the wall didn't stop. In fact, cutting the power seemed to have angered whatever was back there. The concrete wall shuddered violently, and a fine crack, thick and black, spider-webbed out from the center. Through the deepening crack, a stench unlike anything they had smelled before erupted, a concentrated mix of brine, metal, and profound decay. And then, a sound, a low, resonant, and continuous growl that wasn't animalistic, but sounded like a vast, heavy machine vibrating at its limit. Move, now. That wall won't hold, Vance yelled, pushing Sarah back toward the stairs, but as they reached the steps, the heavy steel door at the top slammed shut, plunging them into absolute isolation. The sound of the deadbolt locking was sickeningly final. The creature upstairs. It followed us, or it anticipated us, Sarah muttered, panic creeping into her voice. They were trapped between the growing threat behind the concrete wall and the intelligent, terrifying entity that had sealed the door. Vance saw a small, red button hidden beneath the workbench. It was labeled, Contingency, Primary Enclosure Purge. This might be it, Sarah. Thorne's last resort. He pressed the button. Nothing happened immediately. Then, a faint, rhythmic clinking sound started, coming from all directions. Sarah looked up, shining her light on the ceiling above the reinforced wall. Small, nearly invisible nozzles were retracting into the concrete. Gas, Elias. It's an airtight bunker. We're about to be purged, Sarah realized, her voice tight with adrenaline. But what is he purging? The replicas? Or the thing behind the wall? Vance countered, pulling a handkerchief over his face. The wall groaned one last time, and a thick, yellowish-gray mist began to seep through the spreading cracks. It wasn't the gas from the ceiling nozzles. This was coming from inside the primary enclosure. The growling intensified, and a single, immense object slammed into the wall. The concrete gave way with a sound like grinding teeth. As the dust settled, the flashlight beams revealed what Thorne had sealed away. It was not a beast. It was a machine. A gigantic, complex apparatus of pulsating flesh, chrome tubes, and vast, humming glass vats. Wires, thick as fire hoses, were fed from the living tissue into the surrounding concrete structure. The center of the machine was a pulsating, dark red sphere, crisscrossed with thick veins, and standing on a platform in front of the machine, staring at them with a calm, knowing expression, was one of the replicas, the woman labeled Replica Zeta, Reserve. She was fully dressed now in Thorne's silk pajamas, holding a large, ornate silver key. "Hello, Detectives Vance and Mendez," the woman said, her voice Thorne's but smoother, more feminine. "My apologies for the inconvenience. The system is still syncing. You have arrived just in time for the 0 hour." She gestured toward the colossal, organic machine. "This is the source. And I am the architect. Thorne was just the caretaker. The conduit is open, and my time here is nearly complete. That thing upstairs? It's just the delivery service." She held up the silver key. "This opens the door. But you won't be leaving. You're needed for Phase 4. The replica, Zeta, stood before the colossal source machine, a pulsating cathedral of organic matter and cold machinery. Her face, a flawless duplicate of the woman in the refrigerator, held a calm, terrifying certainty. "Phase 4 requires new templates, detectives," she explained, taking a single, slow step toward them. The silver key glinted in her hand. Thorne was only capable of opening the aperture. "I am here to facilitate the transition." Vance raised his pistol, aiming squarely at her head. "Drop the key, Zeta. We're police. You're under arrest." Zeta smiled, a slow, unsettling movement that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Arrest? That is an amusing human concept. Do you arrest a wave for hitting the shore? I am an inevitability, Detective Vance. And you, and your young partner, are perfectly preserved specimens. Ready for optimization." She snapped her fingers. The lights on the main conduit blueprint panel in the basement flashed red, then green, then settled on a blinding, sickly yellow. Immediately, the rhythmic, wet thudding returned, not from behind the broken wall, but from upstairs. It was heavier this time, directly above the central void in the living room. It was the sound of the world's largest, wet heart, beating against the floorboards. "The aperture is opening wider," Zeta noted with clinical detachment. "The delivery service is completing its primary task. The payload is incoming. Sarah, the key!" Vance yelled, using the distraction to fire. He aimed for her shoulder, hoping to disable her without a lethal shot that might trigger a catastrophic reaction. The bullet hit with a soft thwack that was all wrong. It didn't pierce flesh, but was simply absorbed. The fabric of Thorne's silk pajamas rippled, and the bullet dropped to the concrete floor, flattened like a coin. There was no blood. Zeta didn't flinch. She was faster than any human. In a blur, she lunged, not at Vance, but past him, aiming for Sarah, who was closest to the exit stairs. Sarah reacted with police training, pivoting and firing 3-round center mass. They had the same nullifying effect, absorbed, flattened, dropped. Zeta's hand, unnaturally strong, wrapped around Sarah's throat. "You are the nervous system. He is the muscle. Together, you create a complex template. The collective needs complexity." Sarah dropped her gun, clawing desperately at Zeta's grip. Vance vaulted the workbench, seizing a fire extinguisher. He slammed the heavy metal cylinder into Zeta's head with all his force. The blow landed with the sound of a bowling ball hitting wet clay. Zeta released Sarah, staggering back 2 steps. The impact left a deep, pulpy indentation in her skull, but the skin immediately began to shimmer and reknit, like rapid-set gelatin. Vance didn't wait. He grabbed Sarah, pulling her toward the source machine. "The source. If we can't kill her, we kill the machine that made her." The source was still pulsing, the red central sphere beating like a heart. As they approached, the 5 dormant replicas in the glass refrigerators began to stir. Their eyes snapped open, a milky white, and their mouths opened in a synchronized, silent scream. Vance noticed a cluster of thick, organic cables feeding from the pulsating sphere directly into the foundation. It looked like the machine's spinal cord, the main connection. Sarah. Break the spine. Sarah grabbed a heavy-duty bolt cutter from the workbench. Her hands were still shaking, but her eyes were fixed on the target. She jammed the jaws of the cutter around the thickest cable, a pulsating line of gray, veiny matter. Zeta's voice was calm, yet filled with a rising tide of pure, inhuman rage. Do not harm the engine, detectives. It is the beginning of your new world. Zeta closed the distance in a single, silent glide. She tackled Vance, pinning him to the ground with impossible force. He struggled, feeling his ribs creak under her weight, the stench of ozone and decay pouring from her pores. Sarah, meanwhile, exerted every ounce of her strength on the bolt cutters. With a final, agonizing metallic crunch, the cable was severed. The immediate effect was devastating. The source machine shrieked, a high-frequency electronic whine mixed with the sound of a dying animal. The red sphere turned instantly black, collapsing inward. The glass refrigerators housing the replicas exploded outward, showering the lab in jagged shards and preserved biological material, and then, silence. Zeta froze, hovering over Vance, her face contorted in a mask of pure, instantaneous grief and fury. Her skin began to bubble, and the wound on her head started to weep thick, oily fluid. The victory was momentary. From the severed cable, a plume of acrid, pressurized gas shot out, directly onto Sarah's face. She collapsed, screaming, clutching her eyes. Vance seized the opportunity, shoving Zeta off him. The replica was staggering, her body convulsing as the connection to the source was severed. Then, from the stairs above, the delivery service creature made its move. The steel door to the basement began to buckle, a jagged tear appearing at the center, followed by the sight of its grotesque, multifaceted eye peering through the opening. But the source wasn't dead. As the creature upstairs began to claw its way down, the black, collapsed sphere of the source machine gave one last, final pulse. The floor vibrated, and the entire basement went into a sudden, deep freeze. Vance looked at Sarah, who was blinded and in agony. He looked at Zeta, who was regenerating quickly, her rage solidifying. He looked at the hole in the ceiling where the second monster was descending, and finally, he looked back at the blueprints. Thorne's final note. Do not exit. Seal it. Thorne never intended for them to escape. He intended for them to seal the house from the outside. The basement was a frozen tomb. The abrupt, intense cold from the source machine's final pulse had covered everything, the floor, the pipes, the remaining replicas, in a fine layer of icy condensation. Sarah lay on the concrete, gasping, her hands over her eyes, the corrosive gas from the severed cable having done its work. Zeta, the replica, was also struggling. The severed connection to the source had left her body in a state of violent, painful instability. The hole in her head was sealing slower now, and her movements were jerky, uncoordinated. She was reduced from a flawless operator to a wounded, volatile predator. Above them, the steel door was bending inward. The grotesque, chitinous delivery service creature from upstairs was forcing its way into the basement, driven by instinct and the collapse of the power grid it was designed to protect. Its wet, segmented limbs scraped against the bending steel. Vance had seconds. He had to stop the creature, help Sarah, and then follow Thorne's final, desperate instruction, seal it. He rushed to Sarah, pulling her into a protective crouch behind the solid marble island. Sarah, listen to me. Your eyes. Are you completely blind? Can't see anything, Elias. Just fire. It burns. "Get out of here," she choked out, her voice raw. "No. We finished the job." Vance quickly scanned the workbench and the blueprints. He spotted a series of large, cylindrical canisters labeled Phase 6 dissolution agent, powerful industrial solvents, likely designed to clean the facility or dispose of failed replicas. That he needed a distraction, and he needed that silver key that Zeta had dropped when he hit her. Zeta was now on her feet, staggering toward the center of the lab, instinctively moving toward the source. She was mutating, her skin tightening over her bones, her proportions beginning to distort. The regeneration was failing. Vance grabbed one of the dissolution agent canisters. He uncapped it and flung the caustic chemical directly onto the floor in the path between Zeta and the stairs. The agent instantly ate through the thin layer of ice and began dissolving the concrete floor with a violent, white foam. Zeta roared, a sound less like Thorne's voice and more like grinding stone, and stopped, assessing the corrosive barrier. Vance used the moment to sprint toward the silver key, which was lying near the collapsed source engine. As he bent down, the delivery service creature above finally managed to rip the steel door open with a shriek of tearing metal. It dropped heavily to the basement floor, a horrifying mess of limbs, mandibles, and the lingering residue of Alistair Thorne. It was blind to the replica, focused entirely on the first living warmth it detected. Vance seized the key. The creature lunged. He rolled under a workbench, narrowly avoiding the swipe of a needle-tipped appendage that scored a deep gouge into the marble island. "Sarah." "The blueprint!" Vance yelled, scrambling to his feet. "Can you remember the layout? Thorne's final failsafe. It's marked by the red cross." Sarah, despite the agony, forced herself to focus, visualizing the architectural plans she had just read. "The boiler, the primary gas main, it runs through the center wall. There's a manual bypass valve labeled Contingency Seal, Sector 14 Isolation, it floods the sublevel utility cavity. The source machine was a dead end. The replica was regenerating too fast. The creature was too tough. The only way to stop the 0 hour was to destroy the entire house." Vance found the manual bypass valve, a rusted iron will set into the concrete floor near the back wall. It was next to a thick, lead-lined pipe. He plunged the silver key into a heavy, secondary lock next to the wheel. Clunk. The key turned, unlocking the valve. Zeta, recognizing the finality of the action, screamed and launched herself across the corrosive foam, ignoring the agonizing burn as the dissolution agent ate into her synthetic flesh. She was a horrifying mix of exposed muscle and bone, but she was closing. Fast. Vance grabbed the wheel, his muscles screaming as he started to turn the heavy mechanism. It was frozen, caked in years of neglect and the source's icy pulse. The delivery service creature was faster. It skittered across the floor, bypassing Zeta and the dissolving concrete. It reached Vance and slammed its massive, needle-like appendage down, narrowly missing his hand as he desperately strained against the wheel. Screech. The metal of the wheel gave a sickening grind, and gas began to hiss from the pipe. Zeta reached them, seizing Vance's arm. Her grip was immense, crushing. "You will not seal us. The collective will not be denied its new home." Vance yelled in pain, his bone protesting the pressure. He looked past Zeta at Sarah. Sarah, blinded but functioning purely on instinct, had managed to crawl to the butcher block where Vance had grabbed the arm. She felt around, finding one of the long, sharpened knives. She heard the struggle, the alien roar, and her partner's cry of agony. She lunged, guided by sound alone, plunging the knife with desperate force. The blade found a weak spot, the back of Zeta's neck, the junction where her head met the body. The replica's roar was cut short by a sound like a wet vacuum being unplugged. She collapsed, convulsing, her hold on Vance released. Vance gave one final, primal shove on the wheel. It spun 3 full rotations. Kzzzzzzzzzt, the house shuddered. The lead-lined pipe next to them burst, spewing highly pressurized methane gas into the utility cavity beneath the house. Vance grabbed Sarah, dragging her toward the stairs, ignoring the sounds of the delivery service creature thrashing wildly in the poisonous atmosphere. "We have to get outside. Now." They reached the sealed steel door. Vance, using the last of his strength, frantically used the silver key to unlock the multiple deadbolts. Click, clack, click, they burst through the door, staggering into the hallway, just as the basement below them became a pressurized vessel of highly flammable gas. Vance dragged Sarah through the kitchen, across the ornate Victorian hallway, and burst out the front door, slamming the heavy oak shut behind them. The deadbolt mechanism, which had sealed them in, now served as their last barrier against the chaos inside. The metallic, organic smell of the Conduit house was instantly replaced by the clean, sharp scent of the rain-washed night. The air tasted like survival. Vance barely managed to get Sarah 20 feet from the porch before the detonation occurred. The explosion wasn't a roar, it was a pressurized whump, a muffled, sickening sound that shook the very ground beneath them. The highly concentrated methane gas, combined with whatever residual energy was left in the conduit circuits, ignited. A wave of intense, furnace-like heat slammed into their backs. The roof of 412 Willow Creek Lane lifted slightly, then settled back down, steaming and warping. The windows blew out simultaneously, showering the front lawn with glittering shards of glass. The entire structure was enveloped in a sudden, brief flash of internal combustion, contained by Thorne's reinforced walls. The fire that followed was not fierce, it was a lazy, smoldering inferno, characterized by a thick, strangely colored smoke that rose straight into the pre-dawn sky. The smoke was dark gray with an unnerving green tint, smelling of ozone, chemicals, and burnt meat. Vance collapsed next to Sarah on the wet lawn, his ears ringing, his lungs searing. He checked his partner. Sarah was breathing shallowly, her face pale, the corrosive burn around her eyes looking like raw, weeping plastic. "Backup, where is backup?" Vance muttered, reaching for the radio on his shoulder. He raised it to his lips. 373 to dispatch. "We have an industrial event at 412 Willow Creek Lane. Total structural collapse. Fire contained but volatile. Advise all incoming units to hold a perimeter 1 block out. Do not, I repeat, do not approach the immediate area without hazmat protection. Code 0 Echo. We need immediate medical on a detective." The radio crackled. A frantic, professional voice responded, "Copy, 373. 0 Echo confirmed. Medics and battalion chief inbound. Detective, are the perps contained?" Vance stared at the smoldering house, which now resembled a melting statue of horror. He knew the delivery service creature and the replica, Zeta, were certainly destroyed in that intense heat and gas pressure. The source was crippled, but the void, the circular anomaly in the living room floor, was still there. He could see its outline through the ruined front wall, a core of absolute blackness that no fire could touch. The threats are neutralized for now, dispatch. But the site is still highly unstable. And dispatch, log this, the victim, Alistair Thorne, was operating a biological weapons facility under the guise of a residence. Vance lied, using familiar terminology to contain the incomprehensible. He couldn't say, extra-dimensional conduit. Not yet. He helped Sarah sit up, holding her close as she shivered violently. As the first sirens wailed in the distance, slowly growing louder, Vance felt the sudden, horrible realization of their situation. He was about to be the center of a massive police investigation, tasked with explaining a burnt-out house, a missing architect, an exploding basement, and a severely injured partner. He had the silver key, the key to the failsafe, clutched in his hand. He had the knowledge of the replicas and the conduit. But he had no physical evidence that the threats were anything but highly organized, very strange criminals. Then, a movement caught his eye. A sleek, black SUV, utterly devoid of markings, was parked down the street, almost camouflaged by the tall trees and the remaining pre-dawn darkness. It was too clean, too still, to be a neighbor's car. As he watched, the driver's window silently rolled down. A figure in the driver's seat, a man with neatly combed silver hair and wearing a black suit, looked directly at Vance. His face was devoid of expression, his eyes cold and assessing. He didn't look scared or curious about the explosion. He looked informed. The man raised his hand, not in greeting, but in a precise, measured gesture. He held up exactly 4 fingers. Before Vance could react, the window silently rolled back up. The SUV's engine gave a soft, powerful hum, and it glided away, making no sound, blending instantly back into the shadows. It was a warning. A confirmation. The collective knew they had survived. They knew the conduit was damaged, and the 4 fingers? For more replicas remained, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. For more attempts to open the 0 hour, Vance looked at the silver key in his hand, then at the smoking remains of the house, and finally at Sarah, whose career, and sight, were likely gone. He knew their shift had not ended. It had just begun. The flashing red and blue lights were a sickening parody of the horror they had just escaped. Viridian City's finest, followed by the fire battalion chief, medics, and a swarm of internal affairs, IA, personnel, quickly converged on 412 Willow Creek Lane. Vance was immediately separated from Sarah, who was whisked away on a stretcher, clutching his hand until the last possible second. Her injury was severe, and the medics were already talking about chemical burns and permanent damage. Detective Vance, visibly scorched and covered in the dark, smoky residue of the conduit, was placed in a sterile, temporary tent 100 yards from the smoldering remains of the house. He wasn't given medical attention. He was given a chair, a bottle of lukewarm water, and a direct order to not leave. The man who took the chair opposite him was Captain Robert Sterling, the precinct's most notorious IA investigator, a man whose career was built on sniffing out weakness and corruption. Sterling was immaculate, untouched by the chaos, his suit pressed, his silver hair perfectly combed, eerily similar to the man in the black SUV. Detective Vance. Start from the beginning. Sterling's voice was low, gravelly, and utterly emotionless. He didn't offer a courtesy, a jacket, or even a sympathetic glance toward the still-smoking crater. Vance began the story, sticking meticulously to the verifiable facts: the silent BNE alarm, the discovery of the architect Alistair Thorne, the armed encounter, and the accidental structural collapse due to a gas leak during their pursuit of the perpetrator. He consciously omitted the zero echo code, the otherworldly stench, the collapsing void, the multi-limb delivery service creature, the replicas, and the sentient, regenerating Zeta. He had to. He knew the truth would sound like a psychotic break and would immediately discredit him. Sterling listened for an hour, taking notes with a careful, precise pen, his eyes never leaving Vance's face. "So, Detective," Sterling interrupted, placing the pen down with an audible click. "You and Detective Mendez, upon finding the homeowner murdered, chased the suspect, a single, violent perpetrator, into the basement, where you triggered a massive methane explosion by turning a rusted valve with a silver key you found nearby." "That's correct, Captain. It was a chaotic situation. Self-defense and containment." "And the suspect? What did this single perpetrator look like?" Vance hesitated. "Male. Caucasian. Tall. Dark clothing." He was describing Alistair Thorne, but in a way that sounded like a generic criminal. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. A single perpetrator, Detective Vance. Yet, Detective Mendez's initial radio transmission, before she went offline, mentioned an organic anomaly and 2 distinct threats. She used the term vessel and referenced a hazmat situation involving something impossibly organic. Vance felt the tightening coil of the trap. He hadn't been informed that Sarah had transmitted those critical, damning details. Captain, under extreme duress, in darkness and confusion, or cover-up? Sterling cut in, his voice rising slightly. Let's review the facts the fire marshal has already established. First, the entire substructure of the house was heavily reinforced concrete and lead-lined steel. Second, the explosion wasn't an accident, it was a highly pressurized internal detonation consistent with an industrial sabotage charge. Third, the homeowner, Alistair Thorne, is not dead. His body, or what remains of it, has been officially classified as missing, pending DNA confirmation of the recovered biological residue. Sterling pushed a photograph across the table. It was a close-up of a shattered piece of glass from one of the refrigerators. Pinned beneath the glass, preserved and visible, was a scrap of pale skin. Forensics confirmed traces of a highly advanced, complex polymer in the residue, not flesh, Detective. Something manufactured. Vance's heart hammered. They already knew about the replicas. We believe. Thorne was dealing in highly illegal, experimental bioweapons, perhaps smuggling them in through a hidden vault. You and Mendez may have inadvertently triggered his own security measure, Sterling stated, giving Vance the official, deniable cover story. Vance met his gaze, understanding now. Sterling wasn't trying to expose him, he was trying to establish a narrative. A narrative that perfectly explained the visible destruction while omitting the terrifying, uncontainable truth of the conduit. What is the department's position, Captain? Vance asked, his voice low. Sterling looked away from the tent flap, toward the street where the black SUV had been parked. The department's position, Detective, is that Alistair Thorne was operating a secret biological weapons lab. You and Mendez are heroes for containing the threat. However, due to Detective Mendez's compromised testimony regarding organic anomalies, and your own close proximity to the chemical blast, your investigation of this matter is officially terminated. He pulled out an envelope, a paid administrative leave notice. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Do not speak to the media. Do not speak to anyone about what you think you saw. For your and Detective Mendez's safety, stay quiet. Vance knew the truth. The official investigation was already being run by the shadowy collective that Sterling and the man in the SUV represented. They weren't protecting the city, they were protecting the secret of the conduit. Vance took the envelope. He gripped the silver key tighter in his pocket. And if I don't, Captain? Sterling's cold gaze returned. He didn't threaten Vance's job. He went for the only thing Vance cared about. Detective Mendez is being transferred to a secure, private medical facility. Her care is expensive. Her rehabilitation will be long. Cooperation ensures the best possible outcome for your partner. Discretion, Detective Vance, is protection. Detective Elias Vance was a ghost in Viridian City. Officially on paid administrative leave, his badge and weapon confiscated, he felt the suffocating pressure of absolute isolation. His only possessions of value were the clothes on his back, the knowledge of the horrors at 412 Willow Creek Lane, and the ornate silver key now resting on his motel room desk that he sat in the sterile, cheap motel room, obsessively tracking the news. Captain Sterling's narrative held fast. Alistair Thorne was a reclusive bioweapons trafficker whose illegal lab detonated, killing him and injuring the hero cops who cornered him. No mention of the void, the source, or the grotesque creature. The official silence was deafening. Sarah had vanished into the secure, private medical facility, a place Vance couldn't visit, couldn't call, and couldn't even confirm existed. She was Sterling's leverage. Vance knew he couldn't fight the collective head-on. They were too deeply embedded. He had to think like Thorne, the architect who built a cage for the thing he called the collective. The silver key. It was more than a key to the fail-safe lock. It was intricately designed, heavy, and cold to the touch. It was not a mass-produced item. Vance found the nearest public library, a relic of solid stone and silence, and submerged himself in municipal records, zoning maps, and archived architectural journals. He focused on the only name he trusted, Alistair Thorne. Thorne was indeed brilliant, a celebrated architect who specialized in highly secure, self-sustaining structures. He was obsessed with containment and flow control. His firm, now mysteriously dissolved, had handled massive city planning projects, often involving deep sublevels and utility infrastructure. Vance located Thorne's final, public-facing project before his reclusion, the Viridian City Central Utility Hub, VCCUH, a vast network of tunnels, pumping stations, and energy converters located beneath the oldest sector of the city. A project dedicated to managing the city's resources. Vance remembered Zeta's words, "The collective will not be denied its new home." And Thorne's final note, "Pray for Viridian." The VCCUH was the city's nervous system. If the collective wanted a new home, they would target the infrastructure. Using the silver key, Vance scratched a tiny mark on the motel room desk, comparing it to a high-resolution image of one of Thorne's architectural sketches. He noticed a recurrent, unique symbol, a stylized, inverted trident, hidden within the ventilation schematics of VCCUH. He brought the silver key close to the sketch. The head of the key perfectly matched the negative space of the inverted trident symbol. The key was a universal access tool, likely designed to bypass the security in all of Thorne's major constructions. The collective had targeted the house to open a conduit for a payload. The payload was now destroyed, but the collective's agents, the 4 remaining replicas, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, were still out there, likely seeking a new, more strategic location to open the next void. A utility hub. Massive tunnels. Endless conduits. Vance made a call to the only other person he knew who had seen the truth, Dr. Alistair Thorne, Alistair's estranged younger brother, a paranoid cryptographer who had published fringe theories about architecture and dimensional folding. Before being laughed out of the university, Vance had to use a burner phone. He needed a local, disconnected expert. "Dr. Thorne," Vance began, his voice rough. "My name is Elias Vance. I'm a police detective. I was at your brother's house." The line was silent for a beat, then Dr. Thorne's voice, raspy and terrified, came through. "The conduit, did he open it? Did the collective find him? He sealed it, but he's gone. His lab is destroyed. I need to know why he built a house that could summon something from another dimension." Dr. Thorne spoke, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of madness and clarity. "Alistair didn't build it to summon them, detective. He built it to study them. He called the material they travel through zero matter. They don't exist in our dimension, they need a bridge. The house was Phase 3, a temporary, self-contained bridge with a limited payload capacity." He paused, a ragged gasp on the line. "They failed Phase 3. They will go straight to Phase 4, the engine. The city's main power grid. The conduits beneath the city are the only structure large enough to handle their full arrival. The VCCUH, detective. That's where they're heading. They don't want a single house. They want the whole city, powered by the collective mass of the void." Vance hung up the phone. The police and IA were protecting the secret. The silver key was his only advantage. The VCCUH was the target. The remaining 4 replicas were the catalysts that he pulled a map of Viridian City from his backpack, focusing on the dark, winding lines that marked the subterranean utility tunnels. His isolation was complete, but his mission was terrifyingly clear. The Viridian City Central Utility Hub, VCCUH, was a massive, subterranean labyrinth of concrete, copper, and churning water, the true heart of the city's power and waste management. It was a place designed for maintenance, not defense. Vance, dressed in dark, worn clothing and armed with nothing but a crowbar and the silver key, slipped through a barely secured service grate in an abandoned municipal park, a location Thorne had meticulously documented in his blueprints. The air in the tunnels was heavy, smelling of ozone, mineral deposits, and the ceaseless churn of machinery. He moved through the echoing darkness, his flashlight beam revealing mile after mile of identical concrete corridors. He was a ghost in the machine that he used the silver key on the few keycard readers he found. The key was indeed a master access tool for Thorne's designs, clicking open heavy, pressurized doors that would have taken hours to breach otherwise. Vance knew the goal, the main energy nexus, the largest subterranean chamber, where the city's power conduits converged. If the collective wanted to create a permanent zero-matter bridge, an engine, that was where they'd start. As he reached a pumping station, a deafening chamber of roaring, pressurized water, Vance saw his first sign of the collective's active presence, a smear of dark, metallic fluid on the polished steel floor. It was the same thick, organic residue that had dripped from the ceiling at 412 Willow Creek Lane. He stopped, turning off his flashlight and flattening himself against a cold pipe. He listened over the roar of the pumps. Clack. Tap. Clack. The sound was rhythmic, too measured to be a human worker. It was the careful, deliberate movement of a replica. He peered around the corner of a massive turbine. Standing next to the main electrical panel was a figure, Replica Alpha. It was male, tall, dressed in high-vis utility gear, a perfect disguise for this environment. Alpha was systematically cutting the power lines, but not randomly. He was rerouting them, connecting the main grid to a massive, circular device, a scaled-up version of the conduit apparatus from Thorne's house, now humming with captured energy. The new conduit was a flawless, polished silver disc, nearly 15 feet in diameter, embedded vertically into the concrete wall. The air around it shimmered with latent heat, and the faint, unsettling scent of ozone was thick in the air. Alpha was the muscle, focused purely on the mechanical task. He was fast and strong, easily manipulating cables that required a crane. Vance had to disable the new conduit without being seen. He couldn't risk a direct confrontation, he had no firepower. He remembered Thorne's philosophy, destroy the source, not the vessel. The weakness of the replicas was their reliance on the originating zero-matter flow. Vance scanned the room. Above the new conduit, a massive valve was built into the ceiling, part of the cooling system for the turbines. He climbed the scaffolding, the metal vibrating with the pump's immense power. He reached the cooling valve, 100 feet above the floor. As he began to turn the manual override, a rusty, screeching effort, Alpha stopped his work. The replica tilted his head, his face a neutral mask, but his action suggested he knew he was not alone. Alpha looked up, his movements too slow, too deliberate. His gaze fixed instantly on Vance, despite the darkness and distance. The replica was tuned to heat and motion. Vance worked the valve furiously. With a final, agonizing wrench, the mechanism broke free. A high-pressure jet of super-chilled coolant, a non-conductive, cryogenic liquid, erupted from the pipe, aimed directly at the vertical silver disc that was the new conduit. The cryogenic shock hit the shimmering anomaly. There was no explosion, but a massive, sudden implosion. The air was instantly sucked toward the disc, and the massive 15-foot circle turned from silver to black, then crystallized into a brittle, frozen structure. Alpha screamed, a high, mechanical whine of pure data loss, and lunged. Not at Vance, but at the frozen conduit. Trying to protect it, Vance scrambled down the scaffolding as the replica roared, its immense strength now focused on him. Alpha ripped a thick pipe from the wall, swinging it with enough force to cleave a car in half. Vance dodged, sprinting into the maze of steam pipes and electrical boxes. The replica was relentless, tearing through the obstacles with shocking ease. Vance found a temporary relief in a narrow maintenance tunnel, slamming the security door shut behind him. He locked it with the silver key. The replica hit the door once, twice, 3 times. The steel bent inward, but held. Vance collapsed against the opposite wall, gasping for breath. The terrifying image of Alpha's neutral face and immense power seared into his memory. He had destroyed the new conduit, buying the city minutes, perhaps hours. But the delivery service creature had been a horror. Zeta had been an intelligence. Alpha was just brute, focused efficiency. He had used up the element of surprise. He needed a permanent solution, and he knew the collective wouldn't stop at 3 remaining replicas. Vance retreated deeper into the VCCUH tunnels, the screech of metal and the frantic, echoing slams of replica Alpha trying to tear through the security door fading behind him. He needed light, leverage, and time, all of which were rapidly running out. He checked the map he had salvaged from Thorne's blueprints. He was in the lower pressure conduits, miles of winding, obsolete pipes. Above him was the main energy nexus, the site of the destroyed conduit, and further up, the control room, where the final 3 replicas, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, were almost certainly coordinating the next, and likely final, phase. He found a secluded access hatch behind a steam valve and used the silver key to open it. It led into a cramped service crawlspace, mercifully quiet. Vance pulled out a crumpled, greasy paper, the remnants of Thorne's final whiteboard sketches. They weren't equations, they were a conceptual drawing labeled, "The Engine, Phase 4 Integration." The drawing depicted the city's entire energy grid overlaid with the inverted trident symbol. The critical note was scrawled at the bottom, not a structure. A frequency. FQ is the receiver. Power must be inverted to repel zero matter. Vance understood. The collective wasn't trying to build another physical conduit. They were trying to tune the entire VCCUH to a frequency that would turn the entire city power grid into a single, massive, permanent engine, a dimensional bridge wide enough for the entire collective to arrive. He realized the danger of the other 3 replicas working together. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He had to get to the control room. He climbed a vertical ladder, emerging into a narrow service hallway near the top of the VCCUH. The atmosphere here was different, cold, clinical, and silent. He moved cautiously toward the control room, the heart of the facility. Vance peered through the thick glass window of the control room. It was a semicircular space filled with monitors and control panels. 3 figures were working with terrifying coordination. Replica Beta, female, slight build, focused on the main communications array, was overriding the VC's emergency broadcast systems. Replica Gamma, male, muscular, handling the main circuit breakers, was manipulating the power flow to the entire city. Replica Delta, male, older, calmly typing code into the master computer, was setting the final frequency. They didn't look up, their movements precise and economical. They were just minutes away from completing the transformation. Beta looked at a flashing green light on her console. Alpha has been delayed. Conduit 1 failure. Proceeding to frequency activation on schedule -3 minutes. Gamma confirmed, energy flow diverted. City power stability at 60%. Ready for inversion. Delta typed a final line of code. Frequency set. Final countdown initiated. Prepare the collective's welcome. Vance was out of time. He used the silver key to unlock the heavy, electromagnetically sealed door and burst in, crowbar raised. Police. Freeze. The three replicas turned in synchronized slow motion. Their eyes, identical, dead black, fixed on him. There was no surprise, only a cold, measured adjustment of the plan. The caretaker's accomplice, Beta stated, her voice a precise, synthesized echo of human speech. Irrelevant, Gamma grunted, dropping his work and advancing on Vance. He was immense, radiating sheer physical threat. Vance threw the crowbar hard at Gamma's head, aiming for the same weak spot he'd hit on Zeta. Gamma didn't dodge, he simply caught the crowbar mid-air with one hand, shattering the dense metal handle like dry wood. While Gamma advanced, Delta, the intelligence of the group, calmly pressed a large, illuminated red button on the console. A deafening, ultra-low frequency hum filled the room. The lights flickered, and all the monitors displayed the inverted trident symbol. "The engine is online," Delta announced, his eyes never leaving Vance. "Zero matter ingress is at 5% and accelerating." Vance sidestepped Gamma's brutal swing, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and slammed it into Gamma's midsection. Gamma stumbled, but didn't fall. Vance vaulted the main console, ignoring the rising heat from the panels. He needed to invert the power, as Thorne's note suggested, to turn the welcome signal into a repulsion field. He smashed the monitor showing Delta's frequency code. "Where is the override for the polarity?" Beta, unnaturally fast, was suddenly on him, seizing his arm in a powerful grip. "Resistance is inefficient, Detective." Vance struggled, looking desperately for the solution. He saw a massive, industrial dial labeled Polarity Control. It was currently locked on plus ingress. With Beta's hand crushing his shoulder, Vance reached across the panel with his free hand, plunging the silver key into the locking mechanism of the Polarity Control dial. "No!" all three replicas shouted in unison, their voices overlapping in a jarring, alien chorus. Vance didn't need to turn the massive dial. The silver key, once inserted, acted as a circuit breaker. As the metallic component of the key intersected the flow of zero matter energy, the entire control panel shorted out in a spectacular flash of white-hot plasma. Beta's hand instantly released him, and she staggered back, her face smoking. The lights went out. The oppressive humming stopped. The entire VCCUH was plunged into silent, absolute darkness. Vance collapsed, the heat and ozone stinging his skin. He had stopped the engine, but he had just plunged Viridian City into a total blackout. A new, wet sound started in the darkness, a sound of immense power and cold, alien rage. Not from the replicas in the room, but from the depths of the tunnels. The collective was not deterred. The blackout had only infuriated them. The total blackout was absolute, and the silence in the control room was shattered by a low, rhythmic squelching sound, the sound of something massive moving through the water-filled lower conduits. The collective was now using the VCCUH not as an engine, but as a vast, pressurized aqueduct. The three remaining replicas, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, were temporarily disabled by the power surge, but they were recovering fast. Vance knew the clock on his life had just moved to zero. He had failed to repel the zero matter by reversing the polarity. He had only destroyed the receiver. The massive collective presence was still coming. Vance found the emergency flood controls, a series of heavy, red manual levers along the back wall, designed to section off parts of the VCCUH in case of major pipe breaches. "The conduits are their path," Vance muttered to himself, grabbing the crowbar Gamma had dropped. "If I can't stop the energy, I'll stop the flow." Gamma recovered first, staggering to his feet. His face was scorched, his movements rigid, but his immense strength remained. He charged Vance. Vance met the charge not with a blow, but a maneuver. He jammed the crowbar into Gamma's chest and simultaneously kicked out the replica's leg, sending the massive figure tumbling backward into the main bank of sparking, live servers. Gamma roared as thousands of volts of residual energy surged through his body. He was disabled, twitching and smoking, but not destroyed. Vance didn't look back. He ran to the control levers. The flood controls were manual and heavily protected. Delta, the strategist, was next. The older replica lunged across the floor, aiming for Vance's neck. A thin, silver wire now pulled taut between his hands. Vance ducked under the wire, using his momentum to slam his elbow into Delta's jaw. The sound was a dull thunk, and Delta's perfect replica head twisted unnaturally, its neck breaking with a sound like snapping celery. Delta slumped, the final strategic intelligence eliminated. Only Beta, the communications expert, remained. She was already at the main door, attempting to reactivate the electromagnetic locks, sealing Vance inside the control room with the incoming threat. "The collective is here, Detective Vance," Beta hissed, her voice a fractured transmission. "It fills the tunnels. You cannot survive its arrival." Vance reached the first of the massive red levers, labeled Sector Alpha Flood. He threw it. Whoosh. A shudder ran through the whole building as thousands of gallons of pressurized water were instantly diverted, flooding an entire section of the lower tunnels. The squelching sound from below instantly intensified into a massive, wet roar of fury, the sound distorted by the rushing water. Beta, realizing his plan, abandoned the door and lunged at the remaining levers. "You are condemning the city. This will compromise the Foundation. It's better than condemning the dimension." Vance roared, grappling with her. Beta's movements were fluid and desperate. She was smaller but fought with the focused fury of a cornered hive mind. She managed to slash Vance's cheek with a key card she had retrieved, the cut stinging and bleeding instantly. Vance slammed her head against the wall, but she instantly recovered, driving a sharp elbow into his ribs, making him gasp for air. He seized her arms, shoving her back toward the thick glass window that overlooked the main control floor. He used the silver key, now bent and hot, plunging it into her eye. Beta screamed, a sound of pure agony, as the tool that had opened the conduit now ruptured her primary sensory input. She collapsed, thrashing. Vance through the final two levers, Sector Beta Flood and Sector Gamma Flood. The VCCUH let out a long, grating metal shriek. The Foundation buckled. The control room floor dipped dramatically. The pressurized water combined with the high-voltage electricity shorting in the tunnels caused a catastrophic chain reaction. The whole underground facility was now sealed and electrocuted. The roar from below was a final, immense, dying bellow, a sound that shook the city's bedrock. The zero matter was not killed, but violently repelled by the sudden, overwhelming counterpressure of water and earth, forcibly ejected back through the residual instability of the damaged conduit. Vance looked down at Beta, who was now a twitching, smoking ruin. He didn't hesitate. He picked up the crowbar and brought it down hard, ensuring the final replica was truly extinguished. He had sealed the conduit, sacrificing the VCCUH, the city's power, and possibly the city's structural integrity, but he had bought the world's safety. Vance staggered out of the crumbling VCCUH minutes later, using the escape hatch and the silver key for the final time. The city above was dark, silent, and terrified, plunged into a massive, unexplained power outage. He emerged into the pre-dawn quiet, covered in blood, sweat, and soot, his body aching from a dozen injuries. He walked until he reached the edge of the police perimeter set up around the ruins of 412 Willow Creek Lane. Captain Sterling and two other men in dark suits were waiting for him. Sterling didn't look angry, he looked defeated. "You should have stayed gone, Vance. You just cost the city billions." Vance dropped the shattered crowbar at Sterling's feet. "I saved the dimension. You protected the collective's operation. Tell me where Sarah is. Now." Sterling looked at the two men with him, the same two from the black SUV. One of them, the silver-haired man, stepped forward. "Detective Vance. We are not enemies. We are containment." Thorne was a rogue element. He should never have attempted Phase 3. He compromised our secrecy. We simply clean up the mistakes. The man's voice was smooth, educated, and utterly devoid of warmth. Your partner, Mendez, is in our care. Her eyes can be repaired. Her memory cannot. Vance understood the threat. Sarah would live, but the price was her truth. You'll let her go? You sealed the engine. You will